Tonight, of course, we are fortunate to have the artist and writer Carroll Dunham here, working since the late 1970s in painting, drawing, and printmaking. Carroll is known for, according to his bio, a conceptual approach which has included aspects of abstraction and representation. His exhibitions span the globe, including a mid-career retrospective at the New Museum, I think that was 2002, and inclusion in the Whitney Museum of American Art's opening exhibition in the new building, America is Hard to See. I assume most of you are familiar with this museum's painting, Horse and Rider, My Ex, and the numerous and very telling studies that accompany it, which are currently up in Gallery 5 on the first floor. A great thinker and observer, an important influence on painting today, Carroll is a thoughtful and skilled artist who, to my mind, tackles issues of painting or image making with a clear eye. But I have to say that in reading an essay, or perhaps it was a poem, titled Dead Yellow Mule Garbage Ratio Giant, on his own work in the recently published Into Words, the Selected Writings of Carroll Dunham, he seems to also engage in a lively and ongoing dialogue between himself and the work. It is an introspective and generous piece and a remarkable publication predominantly on the work of others. For that, the artist Paul Chan of Badlands Unlimited, which published Into Words, writes, Dunham writes about what makes an artwork work and why it matters, with the same felt experience that animates his art. And Scott Rothkopf, for the introduction, states, his visual acuity betrays a lived awareness and the alchemical connection between how things get made and seen. Dunham's observations convey a powerful sense of an artist's life of mind and how it intersects with, well, a life. All of which, while written about Carroll Dunham as a writer, I think speaks to Carroll Dunham, the artist. We are so fortunate to have him here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Carroll Dunham.
Thanks, Terry. Thank you for having me here. I know the museum fairly well at this point, and it's hugely meaningful to me that you have this painting of mine here. I thought I would start talking just by showing a picture of it, because it's the only painting here I can be sure you actually could physically see, and the only painting in the slides that I have. And the difference between talking about paintings from projected images and making paintings and experiencing paintings in their immediate physicality is enormous. We all are used at this point to thinking that when we look at images online or images in a book that we're actually seeing art, but we're really not. Even I can barely believe the difference between, because I've been preparing this talk and I haven't seen this painting of mine in quite a while. Even I'm struck by what a difference it is and how strong the physical experience of looking at it is compared to looking at a picture. The thing I really want to talk to you about tonight, while I go through a kind of light speed history of my paintings, is to give you a little bit of an idea of the kind of things that have influenced my thinking and my sensibility as an artist. I think when you just see the painting here and these drawings, which you can see how far it goes from a twinkle in one's eye to a painting when you see drawings like this. I think because I know that someone could come to that painting with no backstory about me or what I think about and deal with that painting almost completely on the level of subject matter. And it's a woman on a horse doing whatever, and it would seem that that's probably where the main meaning experience of the painting might be, is on that level of subject matter, because the subject matter is very, very powerful. Sorry, very powerful, and I think very familiar to anyone, really. I mean, you have more horses here than we do up north where I come from, but everyone knows what it is, and every kid would know what it is. But you know, the subtitle of the painting, My Ex, which when it came to me, I thought it was both true and funny and kind of deep, refers to the fact that the structure of the painting, the actual physical composition of the painting, is constructed around the cross diagonals of the canvas. That's an idea that I've been playing around with for some time, and how it can affect the construction of paintings that involve subject matter, something that interests me a lot. Some of the studies toward the end, it's very clear that the X is contributing to building the image. And in a way, I think for me, the subject of the X is as much a subject as the woman and the horse. When I was a very young artist, not even really an artist at all, in fact, I worked for a woman named Dorothea Rockburn in New York. It was my first real exposure to an actual working artist doing their thing who had a belief system and a point of view that was contemporary and also embedded in art history. And we had for me, a very productive relationship over the course of several years. This is an example of the kind of work she was doing when I worked for her. And you can see there's a big focus on X's. The kind of work that she did, if I can put it that way, and the group of artists that she was associated with. This is a Robert Mangold painting from the early 70s. This is a Robert Ryman painting from a tiny bit later, but serves the point. This was very powerful new information for me and for my friends. And we talked about it a lot, and we really drank the Kool-Aid in a big way. So when I started to actually try to make my own work, I had to deal with the fact that I thought I knew what was being made by slightly older artists that was important and good, and that I had to somehow account for that in my own work and still make something original. It was quite clear to me even in 1974 that when I was 25 years old that elaborating on monochrome painting wasn't really going to mean very much. My initial pass is that this is a painting of mine from the mid-70s, which is, I mean, it's quite absurd to look at it, and it's about this big. You know, it's on a little masonite panel, but it conveys pretty much the essentials of what my repertoire consisted of at the time, which was drawing black lines of a certain kind of configuration and embedding them in these fields of paint that were based on the idea of a monochrome with nuance. They were an attempt on my part to conflate drawing and painting, to acknowledge the importance of physical choices about painting, I guess what we would call process. And I look back on them now with a lot more generosity than I had toward them at the time. They actually seem kind of original to me now. And back then I didn't feel lost, I just felt unsure. And I think one of the reasons was because there was this whole other side to my inner life, which I wasn't at that point willing to confront in my artwork. Before I moved to New York and met so-called real artists and became indoctrinated with seriousness, I was interested in things like surrealist painting. You know, I can still remember seeing my first, this is an Yves Tanguy, marginally less horrifying than a Salvador Dali, which is what I would have been interested in when I was 15 or something. Like many people my age, I was very affected by underground comics and drugs. This is a drawing by S. Clay Wilson, who's way, way crazier than R. Crumb, and just a genius, basically a visual genius. This stuff was huge to me, but I had no idea how to include it in my thinking about painting, serious painting. I also had been reading science fiction since I was a kid and still did. The visual imagination that is elaborated in a lot of science fiction was very important to me, and obviously segues quite powerfully into drug culture, comic art, surrealist aesthetics. This is the cover of a book that I read and reread through the 1970s by Olaf Stapledon, was a important British science fiction writer, a bit younger than H.G. Wells, but on that order of profundity. So, as one does, there's, your art, your inner life is this kind of mulch of the stuff that's influencing you, the stuff you care about, the stuff you're trying to push away, the stuff you're trying to embrace. The whole idea of influence is much more complicated than I think most artists realize this, and this isn't to make some like priesthood or something out of being an artist. It's just that if you live with the experience of loving other art and also wanting to make an original contribution, you're always operating in this kind of tension between embracing things, pushing them away, taking them as encouragement, taking them as cautionary tales, and somehow your art deals with all this while it's also dealing with itself. My big breakthrough was to start to include the surface of my paintings, which were wood panels, very elaborate, covered with very elaborate veneers with kind of complex grain figures on them, and to use the imagery in the veneer as a jumping off point for what I was drawing and painting. So the paintings became a kind of collision of what I was projecting onto them and what they were projecting at me. I still thought of myself as an abstract artist at that time, very much so. There were little nods towards human anatomy, particularly male human anatomy, because I felt like that's something that, since I was male, I could allow to erupt or sneak into the work without it seeming gratuitous. But I also had this big interest in so-called primitive art, or art of exotic cultures, one might say. These are masks from New Guinea, which remarkable things. A completely crazy sensibility with a long tradition. This is art by my wife, Laurie Simmons, who you'll see a lot of that next fall because she's having a big exhibition here. But I think the combination of my interest in non-Western things and the work of people like Laurie, who were my peers, who were going at contemporary art problems in a completely different way that had much more to do with accepting representation as a premise. I had always been pushing it away. I started to think a lot about how abstraction might be able to include characteristics of representation without becoming a kind of retrograde type of painting or type of thinking, which didn't interest me at all. It's never interested. I mean, this is one of the reasons I wanted to show you all this stuff, because my horse and rider painting is hanging here, and it would be appalling to even the person who I was who made these paintings probably would be completely baffled and shocked to know that I'm now the person who makes those paintings. Even though I've just followed a trail of breadcrumbs, that's just been my experience. You know, I haven't ever for a single moment thought that I made an abrupt change in my work. What you're seeing here was continuous with those early paintings to me. I mean, it's still black lines, it's still an interest in a certain kind of brushwork and surface and certain palette of colors, and a lot of the shapes that have come to represent things, as we say, started off as homeless marks in my early drawings. I wish I could, I've made a lot of drawings, and there isn't any way to really give you a look at my influences and interests, a look at the history of my paintings, a look at the history of my drawings, a look at my development in as a printmaker. It's all one thing to me, and it's always kind of braiding in and out. But for purposes of a talk like this, I thought it was just much simpler to let paintings carry the burden of demonstrating the progression. I started to see a possibility for representations of gender in my work about the time, this painting is from the mid-90s, and having gone from trying to think about essentially rectangles with a personality, I started to set up these situations in my paintings which felt almost stage-like. You know, I think this is another reason it's interesting to think about Laurie's work in connection with this, because of her interest in puppets and the straightforwardness of the space in those photographs of hers. And this was still spatially essentially a flat, still embraced flatness as a value or as a condition of painting. But, you know, we're a long way from grappling with Robert Ryman at this point. And here maybe even further. And this painting represents kind of this is where the orbit got really far away from the sun and started to loop back, I think, because I saw a way that my work could go based on this painting, which I filled a couple of notebooks with ideas about this. And at one point I thought I really was going to make a big group of paintings that were this kind of, now it looks like, some depraved idea about Humpty Dumpty on a crazy drug weekend or something, I don't know. But at the time, it just felt like a conflation of all the things, the beginning to put tools in my representations of tools and weapons and heavily gendered body parts, clothing, all kind of accruing to this stupid lump, which is, I guess, still in some way honoring my roots in abstract form. But I never made the paintings. I went through for a period of about a year where I really didn't make paintings, and I looked at a lot of stuff. And to my great good fortune, happened to discover at the Metropolitan Museum an exhibition by the Australian artist Sydney Nolan, who was not an artist I knew. And This is an iconic, no, he's like the most famous artist in Australia, as some of you may know. I mean, he's dead, but he's the most famous modernist to come out of Australia. And we don't really have an equivalent here in the States. I mean, you want to think about someone like Marsden Hartley maybe, except that Nolan was so involved with Australian mythology, and he did a whole series of paintings based on the story of Ned Kelly, and he found a way to represent Ned Kelly as this black square with a hole in it, which is a riff on this iron armor that Ned Kelly apparently wore when he was doing his bank robberies. You can read all about it in Wikipedia. But I got extremely fascinated by Nolan and really hung up on him for a while. And I thought this was a completely different way of thinking about painting and how subject matter and content interact in painting. Around that same time, I was kind of foraging around in backwaters of modernism. This is a painting by a Brazilian artist called Tarsila do Amaral, who coincidentally, her first real show in the States, maybe ever, but certainly in my lifetime, is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York right now, which I haven't seen yet, but I've known her work for about 20 years, and I've thought a lot about it. And it started to get me thinking about looking at these kinds of things, about how the vocabulary that I was using in my paintings might be put into the service of something much more directly about being human, being male, being female. I don't still really have an interest in stories. I'm not interested in the story of a woman on a horse. I'm only interested in it as this kind of instantaneous moment as the painting, which never changes except in terms of how you think about it. I developed this schema of male and female characters, which were elaborations of what I've been doing before, but the scale got bigger and they became much more dominant. And I thought the right thing to do would be to make paintings of male characters, paintings of female characters, having been thoroughly feminized at that point by my friends, my wife, raising 2 daughters, my generational coordinates, all of that. But I really couldn't get it to happen, really, and I started to get deeper and deeper down this rabbit hole of this male character who really didn't really even have a body. It was just this kind of boxy affair with a mouth and a penis and a scrotum growing out of its head, and it frequently had a hat and a jacket and tie. And I put it through all different kinds of painting situations. And this preoccupied me for a long time. I mean, around early 2000s, I spent a couple of years working on a group of all black and white paintings, of which this character was the central structure, everything very involved with. The first time I really developed an idea about landscape in my work. Then I kind of switched gears a bit after I'd finished all of those, and I started focusing on the idea of details of this guy. By that point, I had tried so hard to not have to own the fact that it was a character with any sort of inner life, that it was really just a painting armature. And I kept going with that idea for a while. And it yielded a very rich period in my work, actually. I mean, I look back on it now, and I kind of scratch my head, like, how could I have been interested in this for this long, and in this many different ways? But I was, and there really wasn't anything else I could think of to do. The last painting I showed you, that picture, the paintings have become kind of clean and tight. I've always been interested in these because I think so much about how paintings are made and how that affects what they mean. And I have gone back and forth between what I think of as messy Dunham and clean up tight Dunham, kind of in my mind, always sort of swirling around this same core of subjects and structures, as I call them, to hang the paintings on. But these other things, like I became extremely, this is a picture of Lucio Fontana looking very natty and cutting a hole in a canvas. This is a picture of Niki de Saint-Phal with a rifle shooting balloons, holes in balloons of paint to create a big wall, which we may as well call a painting. And this is a picture from an anatomy book, which I remembered when I was had a recovered memory for various reasons. When I was a kid, my mother had been a nurse, and she had a bunch of anatomy books in the house. And one day when I was maybe 10 years old, I was messing around in one of the rooms in our house, and I found this book and was looking through it, and I found a picture, basically this picture for all intents and purposes. And it was, to say the least, quite a shock. And I don't think I thought it was fake news or anything. I think that I just thought that I just couldn't believe that this was really what was going on. Because I had no idea that that was what was really going on. And those kinds of interest in those artists who are willing to do violence as mark making, and that kind of subject matter, just the intensity of like trying to diagram what's actually real, what's really going on, led me slightly, it kind of deflected my course a bit when I felt I had almost reached the end of working with images of this male character, and I was doodling around one day, and I thought, well, I never even made him have legs or anything. Like, what would it be like? Like, what's going on below his waist? How would you even draw that? Because I'm not interested in drawing human figures. I was never any good at it. It's not the tradition I come from. So I came up with this kind of pictographic version of the bottom of a woman's body, seen from the back, sort of bending forward, stuck onto this humanoid that I'd been drawing. And for some reason, it occurred to me that it should be represented shoving a gun up his own ass. I don't know why that came to me, but it did. And so I made this painting, which is also covered with dirty brown paper. That stuff all over the surface is actually physically there. It's not paint. So the whole thing, it's about, 6 feet square. It's the only square painting I've ever made, actually. I don't like squares. But somehow that also seemed important. There was a whole group of these, but that one is the most sort of lurid. These others tend more towards being, if I could use the word, monumental. But they were, they aren't actually medically representations of hermaphrodites, but they're, that's a word one might use. They're an attempt to condense maleness and femaleness into one image, into one representation, and to see what that would yield as a painting. I was thrilled to be done with all of that. It's not that I'm not, I have no problem, I know what my work looks like, and I have no problem getting behind it. It's just that sometimes I kind of come to these points where I think, okay, there's something else. And one of the things that had, I mean, you can, just to go back for a second, in the upper left of that painting, you can see there's some images of trees and a couple of hills, very simplified kind of schematic renderings of such. And I have had the experience in the past of seeing in the corner of a painting or something that seems like a minor part of a painting, something that actually should become foregrounded and should become more of the focus. So I started thinking about trees. I think I also, this is a Thomas Cole, you know, I went to college in Hartford, Connecticut, and there's a museum in Hartford that has a big collection of Hudson River School painting. I've always been very interested in American landscape painting. It's arguably the first sort of original American painting, actually. And I looked at a lot of it before I even knew I was an artist. And it's also interesting thinking about the way trees were used in early modernism. Mondrian's deconstruction of a tree being probably the most textbook. This is a Brock, who happens to be an artist I'm more interested in. But I started to try to think about how the vocabulary I was involved with could be used to represent this image of nature. And the idea of a tree was the central thing. I went along with it for quite a while. I mean, everything I'm showing you here is highly, I don't know how many paintings of trees I made, maybe 20, maybe 30. Every group of these paintings that I'm showing you, there are a lot of other paintings, but I think these give you the idea enough to just understand the train of thought. And at sort of toward the end of this, I had this residency. I went to live in Rome for 3 months. And when I left, I had in the back of my mind as starting to nag at me the idea that I could actually make a painting of these trees with a human woman in them, a kind of garden with a naked woman in it. And I found it hard to accept. It seemed like kind of a retrograde idea, but I know myself, and I know that if I'm that attracted to an idea, it's not really going to go away. So I went to Rome, and I spent a lot of time looking at paintings, and I spent a lot of time drawing. This is part of the fresco cycle by Annibale Carracci and his brother in the Farnese Palace in Rome, which I think is maybe the most amazing painting event I've ever seen. For me, it's kind of the culmination of so many different trains of thought in European art and Italian painting. It speaks to so many things that I'm interested in. It's hundreds and hundreds of naked human bodies partying down and flying around, and gods and humans and animals, and it's amazing. And when I came back, I realized I was committed. I had to make these paintings of these naked women in these garden settings, if you will. They started off like this, highly schematic, really using the same formal vocabulary that I had used before for other things. I didn't really connect it up to the idea of bathers until I made these paintings. Or this painting and a companion, where I figured out a way to simplify an image of a woman washing her hair. And the whole thing was really interesting to me, the mythological notion of water. It's a sort of archetype of cleaning and bathing and the source and all that. And I started thinking about bathers in art history. Realized it was something I'd looked at a lot without even really being fully conscious of it. This is it's turn of the 19th into the 20th century French painting is the focal point of all this for me. Although you can certainly find that going back and coming forward, this is a Renoir. Picasso, later in life, this is a painting of a woman urinating, which he made when he was quite old, which I think is a complete masterpiece, and always has had a big effect on my sense of what was possible in painting. And I also really liked reading Wonder Woman comics when I was a kid, and I liked the idea that there was a, I don't know, woman superhero. That was good. I liked that. I mean, I have to say I was interested in it before. I didn't really love the Wonder Woman movie. I'm kind of over it by now, but when I was a kid, it was a big deal to me. And when I started getting deeper into this idea of doing bathers, it kind of came out in the drawing. This was the first one where the figure was represented as being kind of more zaftig and muscular, and where you couldn't really think of it anymore as holding back from its full figurativeness, I guess I would say. I mean, the whole quality of the paintings changed. The mood, the space, the sense of roundness and depth, and I just embraced it as an idea for a series. It's called Bathers. It was interesting, the image of Wonder Woman that I got for this lecture has her in the wind holding a tree. Who knows if that was in some way embedded in my unconscious when I made this painting. I certainly wasn't consciously thinking of it. One thing did start to trouble me. You know, I'm always looking at art, and I'm always kind of looking for new things to be interested in. And around the time I was working on that first series of Bathers, discovered the work of this American modernist called Elzir Korder, who's still alive. He's quite old. But I saw a painting of his in the Art Institute of Chicago, which I found amazing. And it was such a straightforward representation of it wasn't this painting, but it was another painting of a nude woman in an interior. And it was a black woman painted by a black man. And I started thinking about this as it applied back to my own work. Like, I don't know any pink women. And I started thinking, I also was getting very interested in Kerry James Marshall's work at this time, and we were fortunately starting to see a lot more work by Black American contemporaries who were interested in painting. I mean, you guys had a big Kahinda Wiley show here at this museum. So it's a very important and wonderful aspect of the art world kind of exploding itself and opening up from what it used to be. But what it got me thinking about was the fact that I wasn't really owning my own straight white maleness by painting pink women that looked like, you know, big wads of bubble gum. I thought of it as well, I actually don't know if I thought of it in any way other than that, you know, when I was growing up, I mean, anyone my age would know this, when you got the Crayola crayon box, there was a kind of salmon-colored crayon that was called Flesh. So that's the degree to which whiteness as normal was embedded in our collective psyches. And it was certainly embedded in my psyche when I started thinking about, I mean, I was unpacking every single aspect of this thing because I was so, well, concerned that it be coming from a healthy and positive place. And that because I don't think of it as business as usual, you know, the artist alone with his naked model. There are no models. I mean, I'm the model. So, but I started to realize that it's utterly gratuitous to continue to make these women in the paintings the way they were. And I realized They either have to be white or black, because that's the way we talk about human bodies. And I'm white, so the women have to be white. And the idea of conflating whiteness as a piece of formal painting vocabulary, and whiteness as a piece of effed up American sociological vocabulary started to seem quite important. So continuing on, that's what I've done. And so, I mean, it's kind of interesting to think about, to me anyway, the figures in these paintings are the least painted part, because the paintings mostly start out as grounds of white gesso. You can see that in the horse and rider painting. If you really look at the woman's body, it's basically the underpainting with a bunch of pencil scribbles on it and some shading, but the rest of the painting is, 30 coats of different color. And there's something about all of these things, the acceptance of active physical women as a subject, the feeling that whiteness needed to be acknowledged. It allowed a lot of other things to come into the work. These images of animals, which was something I had never thought about. And I realized it was actually a tiny step to just let a bird fly into my paintings, or let a horse ride into my painting. And it really changed my sense of where my paintings could sit in the world, like the idea that they could be more like fables and less like formal statements. And as I say, I'm still don't consider myself a person who's interested in narrative. I consider that I'm interested in a very rich and maybe somewhat contradiction-filled pictorial space that allows for the possibility of thinking about narratives if you want to. The reintroduction of maleness took the form of this group of paintings, which I really are kind of an elaboration of something that a 15-year-old might doodle in his notebook during study hall. I mean, it's kind of, what would it be like to draw myself lying down or something? And I actually thought it was a pretty interesting premise for paintings. I hadn't really thought, I knew, this is a Joan Semmel painting. I knew Joan Semmel's work, but I didn't really know that I knew Joan Semmel's work. And a couple of people mentioned it to me when I had an exhibition of those other paintings. And I was pretty amazed, because I don't even think I would have necessarily said I liked Joan Semmel's work. I certainly respected it. And I think it took a lot of courage to make. But I didn't like the way it was painted, and I knew that it came from a really different set of ideas about painting from my own. But I like the fact that at this point in my life, my paintings can have started with, X's and rectangles and whatever, and all this coming from one kind of place, and they can end up being in pretty close dialogue with paintings which come from a completely different kind of place. This is what I did after, this was sort of, this is what kind of where that went. And I started thinking more and more about men. And I think finally getting a sort of confidence that men could be my subject, which I suppose it's almost axiomatic that this, since we know that all art is self-portraiture on some level, this is maybe a more obvious thing about that, although I don't ever think about it that way. But I am biologically male, and I am presently making paintings mostly inhabited by representations of that. One influence is Tarzan comics. Another influence is the kind of art that, this is by guy called Burian, who was a Russian painter of the late 19th century, who, as far as I'm concerned, is some kind of genius. But he was doing like pale illustrations for natural history museums around Russia, paintings of so-called cavemen killing bears and things, but painted in this style that was very common, kind of the pre-impressionism in late 19th century Russia, inhabited by cavemen. It's pretty fabulous. Matisse from the early teens, like 1910, 1912, which was stuff that I had always stared at with great lust and interest and never really knew quite how to let it into my work. This is by a guy called Mike Kuchar, who's a very well-known underground filmmaker and does drawings for gay comics and stuff. And I just think he's a fantastic artist. And this is an emphasis on maleness, which is somewhat different from my own, but the truth of it is really powerful. So just to finish up, I'll show you a few pictures of paintings I've been making in the last couple of years. The main subject has been men wrestling, which has a long tradition in art, as I'm sure you know, going back to classical times. Probably more in classical times than in recent times. But I got very interested in it because I wanted to figure out how to put multiple images of if not groups, at least multiple humans in the same space, and have them involved with more of an activity that would create a space that was deeper and had more contour and more energy, I guess. Men, dogs, wrestling. A group of paintings of men hitting each other with clubs. Those paintings are all green. I'm trying to get away a bit from the sort of coloring book idea of color into something a bit more arbitrary. There's a group of paintings of men who have fallen in battle being investigated by birds. And this painting, which is the last picture, which is a kind of everything but the kitchen sink painting. It's actually probably a little bit bigger than that projection. It's quite large, like 7 by 9 feet or so. And it's the only painting I've made in quite a while now that has an image of a woman in it. But I wanted to allow them all to be together and see what would happen. So dirty men wrestling and a clean woman in the water and all these various things. I should have shown a picture of Edward Hicks, early American artist who painted the subject of the peaceable kingdom over and over again. But that's something I've always loved, and I think I'm trying to find a kind of place like that right now in my paintings for all these activities to take place, to represent a place like that. Do you have any questions? Yes, Michael.
Tip. I only know he was Tip. So you and I are the same generation, Tip, and we grew up on abstraction. And we were taught that abstraction was this sort of universal space, which I think at a certain point, it took me probably longer than you to realize that abstraction could be that universal space, but also a negation of gender. So men could paint paintings that never revealed gender. And even Dorothea Rothberg made paintings in my mind that sort of negated the idea of gender. I mean, there may be subtle nuances in there that I don't see. Once you go into, as you did, and certain artists, Bruce Nolan did it very early on, very few male artists did it, reveal their gender in their art and make it a part of the content. then you can never really go back to abstraction again, can you? I mean, and it seems like your work, this is more, I guess it's a statement and a question, is this back and forth argument about gender, male, female, maybe it comes out of a male living in a female household. I don't know.
That certainly didn't help any.
But, I mean, maybe is there any, I'm sure you must have felt some, as I do in this day and age, some remorse for not being able to go back to abstraction in the way that it was. It was an illusion in certain respects. Do you agree with that? Well,
I think in ways I do, yeah. I mean, I guess the way I think of it is that it seemed to be a kind of opening up of a universal language, but in fact it was extremely culturally specific. There's actually nothing universal about it at all. And I think if you grew up in the Western world in the middle of the 20th century and were interested in art, you were able to have conversations in that language and have them be meaningful in a way that I don't know that you really can now without it seeming like quotation. And I do find that sad, but I also don't feel like making work about being sad. or about, all I know is that it didn't work for me. And I think that most of the art I see by younger painters who are trying to either pick back up my situation was how to get past that. As I said, I knew early on that fiddling around with monochrome for the rest of my life wasn't going to do it. But I see a lot of young painters now in New York who are fiddling around with monochrome. And to me, it looks absolutely trivial. But I also know that they're saying things about it that are different than the kinds of things my friends and I were saying about it. And they probably see things that I don't see it in a way that I don't see, And so it's complicated, but yeah, in many ways I do agree with you. And to the question of whether you can go back or whether, I think of it more like, is it possible that at some point by my following where my work leads me, I could end up in a place where these recognizable subjects disappear again? I mean, I don't know. I can't see it, but I have to do what my paintings tell me. Yeah, Terry.
Do you see any relationship between your kind of hyper-gendered character and Guston's hooded characters or hooded figures?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, that would have, one of the Guston Klansman paintings would have been fit in perfectly well in here. It's stuff that I looked at a great deal when I was younger, and it really opened up some ideas for me. I guess the way I see the difference is that Guston's work is always quite topical. His subjects were the Ku Klux Klan, let's use that as an example, or all those drawings he did of Richard Nixon. Or there's nothing really like that in my work. I'm more interested in a kind of like what I think of as archetypes. But I see those paintings of his as being very involved with certain human archetypes. So it kind of all ends up in the same place.
I sort of see those as being surrogates for him.
Yeah, I think that's a way to look at them.
And do you see any of created the figures, especially the early guy? Was he a surrogate, or was he a way just to negotiate painting?
Probably both. I was always very annoyed by the interpretation that it was meant to somehow stand for me, but I think I was being defensive.
Yeah, I don't see it that way.
No, but I think now with some distance on it, I kind of say, well, what's the big deal? You know, why not? I mean, I was certainly struggling. Whatever that was about, like that kind of reductive image of maleness with, the cock on his head and the suit and stuff. I mean, I made them. They must in some way be reflective of my inner condition or something that my inner condition mixed with what I imagined a painting could be. And that's not such a big step from self-representation, really. I don't really like to think about these things so much in the moment. It's like 10, 15 years down the road, no problem. But at the time, if I think too much about it, I wouldn't do them. I have to tell myself some BS in order to do them, Yeah.
Do you sign all your paintings, and are they always in different positions?
Well, I do sign them all. I sign them and date them when I finish them. I like doing that.
Are they in different positions for a reason? And also...
Well, it's as the mood suits me. Sometimes I sign my name. Lately I've been more doing initials. And I keep notes now. I used to write dates all over the paintings, but then they would just get covered up. So now I write down the side of the canvas the months of the year I'm working on the paintings. And then I have a record of that. And then when I sign the painting, I was just struck when I was looking at the painting here in the museum of, over at the right side of the painting, there's a dense little kind of area of writing, which is all the date, because I worked on that painting for a long time, all the dates and my name. And, I like it because I can look at the paintings and know when I made them and know the order I made things in. And I also think it's symbolically important. It's like the final transfer of title somehow, like I am done with you. Means a lot to me. Yes, I see a hand.
The introduction of animals in your paintings, it always seems that the animal is acknowledging the viewer as opposed to the action in the painting. Is there something to that?
I've noticed that too. No, I mean, I actually noticed it too. I've never done any paintings where these human characters have any even indication of having eyesight, much less looking back out of the painting. I wanted them to be self-involved or involved with each other, turned in on itself somehow within the painting. And the animals, to me, the animals have more personality, more consciousness, more implication of an inner life than any of the people do. And since I'm not really illustrating an idea that I have so much as making what I can make, all I can tell you is, yes, I don't really have an explanation, but it seems to be something I'm comfortable with. And even the horse in the painting is turning around and looking back out of the painting. So somehow that's all right with animals, but not with people. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, Michael.
Just one more thing, Tip. I actually think your paintings are topical. I mean, I know Guston, we can look back on him and say they were about this or that. And I'm probably going to regret saying this, but I think in terms of what's going on in culture right now between men and women, your paintings are quite topical. And it appears to me that you have gone to great lengths to make sure that the women appear as strong and as muscular as the men. Is that a conscious thing, or this?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, I made those paintings were all made before I kind of knew what was going to come afterwards, but I wasn't 100% sure I could pull it off. So I was making drawings, like I started making drawings of men wrestling, the equivalent degree of sketchiness to like the earliest studies for the painting here. Just really notional drawings. And while I was making them, I was kind of coming toward the end of that series of bather paintings. And the women had become, the representations had become very strong, muscular, active. So the two things were definitely sliding into each other. And it was conscious. It was, I guess to be perfectly honest, it was what I wanted to see. It wasn't really, well, you should do this. That wasn't the thinking. It was more like, this would be awesome. This would be great to see. That's more the way it came about. Okay, well, thank you.